So this session, of course, is going to be about U.S. foreign policy with a special emphasis on Latin America. And I want to begin by asking you, there are a lot of things that you did at the OAS. You aggressively promoted the president's policies. What's your biggest accomplishment while you were at the OAS?
Our biggest accomplishment was when we first got in and not having worked in multilateralism and not having worked, obviously, in the OAS, we were always told that we couldn't do anything to delegitimize the Venezuelan government at that time that was led by Nicolas Maduro. And our foreign policy started being built on truly recognizing the leader of, at that point, the opposition, but in the vacancy for not having free and fair democratic elections, the natural succession was Juan Guaido. And the first place that recognized him as a legitimate leader was at the OAS, which wasn't easy, because we had to flip a lot of Caribbean countries that did not recognize him. And it was the first time we built a full-blown diplomatic recognition, not only recognizing the opposition based on the vacancy of the president for not having free and fair democratic elections, but more importantly, giving credibility to the opposition that they were the justified leaders of that country, which ultimately gave them diplomatic recognition in 50-plus countries. So I think that was one of the bedrocks of that policy was run through the OAS.
And President Guaido is here. We're going to hear from him in about 15 minutes. He's here somewhere in the audience with his wife. Carlos, I'm sure you get asked a lot. I get asked a lot of questions in the media about what a second Trump administration might or might not do in terms of our Western Hemisphere policy. Can you give us some insights as to what you think will be some of the priorities that President Trump will implement as the 47th president as it relates to the Western Hemisphere?
So the president was very active in his first administration on the Western Hemisphere, but personnel is policy. And I think there's no person who's been more active in the Western Hemisphere in the last 16 plus years than Senator Marco Rubio. So God willing, I think he'll be confirmed in the first week of the new administration. He's a person who has strong, deep relationships in the hemisphere. He's a person who studied the hemisphere his entire life. He knows what works. He knows what doesn't. So I think he'll be the leader, the right leader at the right time. And I think it's the first time that our foreign policy will really have a deep focus in the Western Hemisphere. Regardless of political administrations, the focus has always been looking towards the Middle East or towards Asia. Obviously, we all recognize China for who they are, but we also recognize the opportunity that the Western Hemisphere has as being part of the solution for nearshoring, for economic growth and development. So I think the administration is really going to be focused on that. You know, how do we really spend the time to build the economic capacity of the Western Hemisphere? How do we encourage nearshoring? How do we use multilateralism and multilateral banks in order to encourage direct foreign investment in the hemisphere? How do we create stronger rule of law? How do we deal with transnational groups? How do we deal with migration? And I think that's really going to be the focus. You have the renegotiation of USMCA before 2026. That's a natural launch point for policy heading into the next 2 years towards the region. You have yesterday the Biden administration announced the sanctions towards Nicaragua and their CAFTA DR, which expire in exactly 1 year. That creates an opportunity to revisit CAFTA DR and whether that trade agreement is working, especially with the inclusion of Nicaragua, totalitarian government without democracy in it. So you have, I think, a lot of focus. You know, people constantly focus on the migratory issue, which is obviously a significant issue that this administration will deal with. But it's also all the economic and political opportunity that exists. In just the last month, the amount of foreign leaders from all political ideologies that have reached out, trying to find the way to work with this upcoming administration, trying to be proactive, trying to find ways that the United States and its neighbors could lead our countries and their countries for the next 4 years has been really, really encouraging.
Personnel really is policy, and in addition to the leadership of Marco Rubio, I'll add that the number 2 in the State Department, Chris Landau, former U.S. ambassador to Mexico, somebody who also understands the region very well, who has lived in Latin America for many years and represented us in Mexico. So I think the State Department is gearing up to be shaping up in the right direction as well.
Chris Landau is someone I worked with in the first Trump administration. He's a good friend, speaks perfect native Spanish, studied in Paraguay. His father was a diplomat for a long time. Yesterday, they just named the ambassador for Mexico, Ron Johnson, happens to live in Miami, another Floridian. His wife also happens to be Cuban-American. But Ron was a spectacular pick for Mexico, a person who's worked in the intelligence agency, who served in the military, who was a former ambassador to El Salvador and had his hand in the success, I think, of Bukele early on and mentoring him and working with him. And I think as a person who's going to be a great, great leader in Mexico. And I think for us, just another proud Floridian to serve in the administration.
Absolutely. One of the things that I really don't understand, and I really mean it, about the current administration's policy towards Latin America is that the administration has rewarded our adversaries and punished our friends. So our policy towards Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, especially Venezuela, sort of easing up sanctions and rewarding the regime until recently, really, in my opinion, makes very little sense. What can we expect from a second Trump administration as it relates to Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, in your opinion?
I think the hemisphere from 2017 to present day, just in the last 8 years, and really in the last 4 or 5, has changed significantly. Our real focus in 2017 and 18 was really trying to bring democracy to very, very difficult totalitarian regimes. But I think if we look at the world of where we are today, just from the geopolitical threat of China, from the mass migration that's affecting our country, and the collapsed states, how it affects the neighbors in the region when it comes to security and economic growth, it's a much more complicated problem. Venezuela, the migratory flows started happening really in 2017, 18, and 19, but progressively, the migratory flows now from Venezuela are completely unsustainable. Panama has 500,000 migrants coming through. Costa Rica has hundreds of thousands. I was in Honduras 2 weeks ago, Venezuelans in every corner. And you really feel bad because there are people looking for an opportunity, and there are people looking for freedom, and there are people fleeing absolutely terrible situations. But as I was speaking to the foreign minister of Costa Rica just yesterday, of all the great people who are coming for opportunity, there were 9 people on the terror watch list who were apprehended just in Costa Rica, a country with limited resources. So if you look at the millions of people who've come across our southern border, I'm sure the super majority are with the best of intentions, but I think there's some who aren't. So I think the migratory issue is going to be something that, as you look at the region and you look at geopolitical threats, you look at even Venezuela. Venezuela at one point purchased 5,000 surface-to-air missiles from Russia. I'm willing to bet you all 5,000 are not accounted for. So there's a lot of complexity from the hemisphere just in the last 6 or 7 years, and how much more dangerous and how much more complicated and how much more fragile the democracy and the security situation has become.
Let me ask you one more question about Venezuela. We had the president-elect show up by video a couple of hours ago. We interviewed him, and he's very hopeful that he'll be able to be sworn in on January 10th. Of course, not everybody's as hopeful as he is. He's still in Spain, as you saw a couple of hours ago. What do you think is going to happen on January 10th?
I honestly don't know. I think it was the Biden administration, Secretary Blinken recognized him as the president-elect, which is, even though it's not a legal title, it's hard to go from president-elect to non-president, right? It's a natural progression in titles. So January 10th, this administration is going to have a difficult decision. If they recognize Mr. Mundo as the president on the 10th, what does that mean? You obviously pray for his personal security and safety. Going into Venezuela under these circumstances and raising your right hand and swearing on the Constitution and on the Bible to uphold the office of the presidency comes with significant repercussions for him, for his family, and for his supporters. So it's going to be some very, very, very tense times over the coming weeks. And I think what's even more difficult is, as you've seen the region change just in the last 4 years, that there's no doubt that he won the election, right? Any rational person will tell you he won the election, regardless of political ideology. But it still can't build consensus within the region that he actually won. When you see some very powerful countries in the hemisphere still failing to even consider who won the elections or failing to criticize the lack of democracy, it shows you that in some situations, unfortunately, the ends always justify the means. And I think it's a very, very dangerous place that some countries are driving our hemisphere towards.
As people were listening to President-elect Gonzalez and anticipating President Guaido's presentation, people were debating about a couple of different options for the Trump administration. I have my own opinions as to which one's more likely, but let me get your take on this. Some people are saying that a Trump 47 administration is going to be very tough on the Maduro regime, impose sanctions, and really insist on democratic change. Others are saying that there might be a deal so that migratory flows diminish, right? A deal that might be beneficiary to the oil industry. What's your take? Which way do you think?
I just don't think they're binary choices, right? I don't think the choices are full sanctions or full deals. I think, like any negotiation, you have to have leverage, you have to have the conditions, you have to have the will. So to preview to say it's going to be massive sanctions to what end? Like, sanctions are a tool, but they're not an outcome. So I think it has to be creating that environment that leads to fruitful negotiation, fruitful dialogue, and a peaceful resolution. And also there are a lot of interplays that are out of our control. If you would have asked us 5 days ago, 7 days ago now, what would happen in Syria, everyone would have said nothing. Here we are 7 days later, right? And Assad is hiding in Russia. So some of these things kind of take on a life of their own. I could tell you Maduro is more concerned than ever about his personal safety. He's more concerned than ever about his viability to stay in office, and to control the military and to control all the transnational criminal groups who have taken refuge in Venezuela. So that creates an opportunity for change, right? What that change will look like and how do we get there? It's, I think, a very, very complicated process.
Let me ask you a broader question, a broader geopolitical question. I have no doubt that the number one foreign policy concern for a second Trump administration will be our relationship with China. And that presents, I think, a tremendous opportunity for Latin America. Because as we all know, for decades, the consensus, both Republican and Democrat, was that the way to deal with China was to engage with them, to trade with them. Because the more we trade with them, the more they're going to look like us, the more democratic and the more capitalist they're going to be. And President Trump comes in 2017 and makes it very clear that that is not the case. Today, the Chinese are neither more democratic nor more capitalist. And so he comes in and says, these guys are not our friends. They're not even our adversaries, they're our enemy. And so there's now a consensus that these companies that for decades went to China and moved their production to China have to come closer. Ideally, they come to the US, but we know that for a number of reasons, it's not always feasible to come to the US. So the logical place for them to relocate is in Latin America, right? Friendshoring, nearshoring, offshoring, you've heard the different terms. That presents a tremendous opportunity for Latin America. Thinking now, as a consultant, as an advisor, what would you recommend Latin American governments to do to seize this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that would allow them to bring American investments, to bring American companies to relocate in their countries and move away from China?
I think Latin America's biggest concern and reason for lack of economic growth is lack of rule of law. Their reputation for not honoring agreements, for having compromised courts, for predatorily going after American businesses for direct investment, it's the reason I think they find themselves where they're in. People are able to overlook a lot of things, but I advise a lot of big funds, and they rather receive a 3% return in the United States than a 25% return in Central America. And why is that? Because you can make 25% for 2 or 3 years, and then you can lose it all the following. And I think the problem Latin America faces, and they have a lot of reasons to criticize American foreign policy, but I think sometimes when they look inward, why do you continue to have these flare-ups when it comes to the business and regulatory climate in Latin America? Starting in Mexico with the Cemex port that was illegally taken, with American investors who have Interpol red notices for absolutely no reason, to some of the issues you've seen in Honduras with the expropriation or almost complete expropriation of energy assets, to obviously Panama has had its historic issues with expropriating or very, very corrupt and compromised court systems, to the issues that oil and gas companies have faced in Ecuador, to Argentina and their default and some of their issues with American shareholders. So the biggest problem they face is honestly the lack of rule of law and lack of structure. What people want in any investment is some sort of concrete return on that investment, right? Some sort of certainty that they're not going to lose it all. They could have some downside, but they obviously look at the upside. But what they can't have is a complete elimination of that asset. And I think the problem Latin America faces is that, right? Like a massive American group went down to Honduras, started a program called Honduras Prospera. It was supposed to be a duty-free zone. They've invested hundreds of millions of dollars, created tens of thousands of jobs. This is a brilliant economic development plan. They got a concession from the Honduran Congress, signed by the president, change of administration. They canceled the concession. There's $100 million of American investment on the sideline. What message does that send to the entire business community? So as much as they talk about nearshoring, if you're a business owner and you're considering Honduras, and you do a 5-second Google search and you find out some group out of New York and Mississippi lost $100 million last month, are you more or less likely to invest in that country? And so I think that's the biggest problem they face. China's corrupt. It's a terrible place to do business. They obviously violate all sorts of human rights. The labor issues are well known and well documented. But I hate to say it, there is some certainty, right? Your product's going to come out, and there is some certainty, at least to the marketplace, under terrible conditions. And I think the biggest problem Latin America faces is the lack of rule of law, and this idea that, ideas and politics don't have consequences. And I think their lack of economic development is uniquely driven by generations of not respecting rule of law and not respecting private enterprise.
I get asked a lot of questions about tariffs. And I always mention that you got to look at tariffs not only as an economic instrument, but as a political instrument. A political instrument that allows leaders, in this case President Trump, to go to a negotiating table and really defend, in this case, American interests in a way that wouldn't be as credible if you didn't threaten to impose tariffs. And we know that when President Trump says he's going to impose tariffs, he means it. How do you look at tariffs, and what can you tell Latin American leaders who are concerned about potential tariffs?
Tariffs are meant to change behavior. Trump won. There was the threat of tariffs on steel. In less than 72 hours, the entire Mexican delegation was at the State Department, and they negotiated migratory agreements for Made in Mexico, third country safe agreements, and participated in some Title 42 expulsions. So if you look at President Trump just last week, he immediately announced a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada. You have Prime Minister Trudeau fly down to Mar-a-Lago and try to meet with them. You have President Sheinbaum immediately doubled down saying, well, we're going to tariff too. But 48 hours later, all the caravans stopped, and it's the largest bust of fentanyl in the history of Mexico. That's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that every caravan that was traversing through that country all of a sudden was dismantled, and the largest bust of fentanyl in the history of the country was all of a sudden discovered. So, the use of tariffs is there has to be a free and fair and mutually beneficial environment. And it's not only when it comes to the economics, right? Money is important, and people making money is important, but it's also to the safety and security of the American people.
A couple more questions. You had a very successful career as a state rep, so you understand local politics as well as anybody. But you also had a very successful career as a diplomat, as the UN permanent representative to the OAS. So you also understand foreign policy. A lot of Americans don't care about foreign policy, yet it's incredibly important. What do you tell the regular American who might think that worrying about what's happening in Ukraine or the Middle East or Latin America is not in their best interest?
So I think COVID taught us a great example of how intertwined the global economy is, right? When people were stockpiling toilet paper and freaking out about every last consumer good, you realize how vulnerable we are as a country and how vulnerable we are as people. And if you look at just the way economic supply chains, and it's from the most basic stuff as toilet paper, but to the supercomputer, the super chip, artificial intelligence, everything else, how intertwined the economy is. So our policy towards Argentina on trade, whether we could import or not import lithium, and where that lithium is sourced into the United States, and where that lithium is put into your Tesla car or to your smartphone or to your computer, it has a direct effect on your everyday life. And I think it's sometimes easy to be very, very simplistic and saying, well, we're the United States, we don't need anything else, but we can't source every last rare earth mineral. We can't source every last product. And we're very, we're part of a global economic system. What that looks like and how it's reshaped, I think is really the conversation. And I think with the geopolitical threats of China, that's a conversation that'll take place over the next 4 years and hopefully for much, much longer than that. But that's really where we're headed with this. I think the new Trump mantra, right, it's not an interventionist mantra. It's not that GOP hawkish. We have to go and nation build and attack everything. But I think it's very, very pragmatic at the same time in figuring out what are those things that we need as a country and what's the best way to achieve them. So if you look at foreign policy, everything is interrelated. I was talking to a minister in Africa last week, and he's like, we have massive food insecurity. I go, why do you have food insecurity in Africa? He goes, because we source all of our grain from Ukraine. So think about it. A conflict in Ukraine, an entire continent away, is causing food insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa, which is causing religious extremism, which is causing terrorist attacks, right? So all these things are kind of interrelated. But it's very, very easy to just brush it over and say, well, what happens in Ukraine will never affect me. It does if you live in sub-Saharan Africa. It does if you're producing LNG off the coast of Texas. All these things are in some one way or another are interrelated.
If I may brag a little bit about you and the center. I was talking before you got to hear about the center. The ambassador is incredibly busy, yet he takes time off every week to come here to Miami to teach a study group, to teach our future leaders about the importance of some of the issues that we've been talking about. Can you tell us just a little summary of what your class is about?
My class deals with foreign policy and nearshoring, and really the race for American competitiveness and the America's competitiveness. But I think what's been most surprising of teaching the class is how engaged and how bright the students are. I obviously wasn't the best of students, so I would sit there and kind of doze off and play on my cell phone or my computer at the time. They ask such good questions. They're so engaged, and they're so knowledgeable about the region, about the political environment, and really about the future. And really asking pointed questions, not that, what's going to affect me today or tomorrow, next week, but really, how does this play out over the course of my lifetime? So it's been a really rewarding experience being here for the last couple of months.
And thank you for doing this. I want to conclude with a question that I'm sure you're getting quite a bit as you do media. I mentioned that you had a very successful career in politics, a very successful career in the federal government as a diplomat, and a very successful career in the private sector as a consultant, as the leader of a very successful firm. For both a legal firm and also public affairs. Will you go into the next administration?
So, I just came here. My wife dropped me off. So, I think everything in life is kind of luck and timing. I've thought about it. I prayed about it. Is it really the right time? I have 4 kids. I served 4 years in the last administration. Is it really the right time in my life to go back into government? Right. And it's not the vanity exercise. Some people want to serve for the vanity, for the title, for the name, for being on a website, for having their picture taken or being in the newspaper. But it's really, do you have something to add, right? Do you have something of value that you can help advance the administration or our country's initiatives? And I don't want to say I don't have anything to add, but I think at this point, I have so much other things going on in my life. Then there's so many other good, competent, qualified people that could serve in government, right? And so my commitment, at least for the foreseeable future, is helping staff, bringing some of the best and brightest minds to serve our country, to serve in the next administration, and hopefully it's not the Republican Party success or Donald Trump's success or Secretary Rubio's success, but it's the success of the American people. So I'm hoping I'm at least lending a hand in doing that,
and helping clients navigate the incredibly complex bureaucracy that is the federal government. And so hopefully you have many potential clients right here in this room. Thank you, Carlos, for taking the time.
Thank you, Carlos.
We couldn't conclude this forum with a better guest, so thank you.